It was one of those lazy Sunday afternoons where the world felt like it moved in slow motion. The kind of day where the ticking of the clock seemed louder, where even the sunlight streaming through the windows felt heavy. My name is Claire and I've been married to Daniel for 5 years. Our marriage wasn't bad. Not in the way people whisper about affairs or screaming matches. It was just quiet, routine, comfortable to the point of suffocation. I had learned to live with it, to tell myself that this was what love looked like after the initial spark faded. Daniel had gone out to visit his mother that day, leaving me alone in the house with Ethan, his 21-year-old son from a previous marriage. Ethan had only moved in with us a few months ago, after dropping out of college for reasons Daniel never fully explained. He was polite, reserved, and always seemed to carry an air of sadness around him, like a cloud that followed him wherever he went. We didn't talk much. He mostly kept to himself in his room, and I was fine with that. That afternoon I was in the kitchen, scrubbing a stubborn stain off a pan, when I heard the bathroom door creak open down the hall. It wasn't a sound I paid much attention to at first. It was just part of the background noise of the house. But then I glanced up and everything changed. Ethan stepped out of the bathroom, and my breath caught in my throat. He was dripping wet, a towel slung low on his hips, exposing the sharp lines of his torso. His dark hair was damp, water droplets trailing down his chest and disappearing beneath the edge of the towel. He was looking at his phone, completely unaware of my presence. For a moment I was frozen, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. It wasn't that I hadn't noticed Ethan was attractive before. He had the kind of effortless good looks that made people turn their heads. But this was different. This was intimate, vulnerable, and I shouldn't have been seeing it. "Ethan," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. He looked up, startled, his face flushing red as he realized I was standing there. "Oh, sorry," he stammered, clutching the towel tighter around his waist. "I forgot my clothes in my room." "It's fine," I said quickly, turning my back to him. "Just be more careful next time." "Yeah, sorry," he mumbled, and I heard his hurried footsteps retreating down the hall. I stood there for a long moment, gripping the edge of the counter, my heart pounding in my chest. It was just an accident, I told myself. Nothing more. But the image of him lingered in my mind, vivid and unshakable. I could still see the way the water glistened on his skin, the way his cheeks had flushed with embarrassment. I shook my head, trying to banish the thoughts. This was ridiculous. He was just a kid. My stepson, for God's sake. The rest of the day passed in a haze. I tried to focus on the mundane tasks of cleaning and organizing, but my mind kept drifting back to that moment in the hallway. When Daniel came home that evening, I forced myself to act normal, plastering a smile on my face and asking about his mother. He didn't notice anything was wrong. He rarely did. That night, as I lay in bed beside him, I stared at the ceiling, my thoughts racing. Why couldn't I stop thinking about it? It wasn't like I was attracted to Ethan. That would be absurd. But there was something about the way he had looked at me, the vulnerability in his eyes that I couldn't shake. It was as though in that brief moment, I had seen him not as my stepson, but as something else entirely. Someone else. The next morning I avoided Ethan. I stayed in the kitchen while he ate breakfast, busying myself with the dishes so I wouldn't have to look at him. He didn't say much, just a quiet "good morning," before retreating to his room. I told myself that was for the best. Distance would help. Time would make me forget. But it didn't. Over the next few days, I found myself hyper-aware of Ethan's presence in the house. Every time he walked into a room, I felt a strange tension settle over me, like the air had grown heavier. I started noticing things about him I hadn't before. The way his voice deepened when he spoke, the way his hands fidgeted when he was nervous, the way his eyes seemed to hold a sadness that made my chest ache. I hated myself for noticing. I hated the way my stomach fluttered when our eyes met, the way I found myself looking for excuses to be near him. This wasn't right. This wasn't who I was. I loved Daniel. I was his wife. Ethan was his son. But the more I tried to push the thoughts away, the stronger they became. One evening, I was sitting in the living room, pretending to read a book, when Ethan walked in. He hesitated in the doorway, as though unsure whether he should stay or leave. "You can sit," I said, my voice coming out softer than I intended. He nodded and sat down on the opposite end of the couch, keeping a careful distance between us. For a while, we sat in silence, the only sound the faint hum of the television in the background. I could feel his eyes on me, and I forced myself to keep my gaze on the pages of my book, even though I wasn't reading a single word. "Claire," he said suddenly, his voice breaking the silence. The days that followed were a strange dance of avoidance and stolen glances. I told myself repeatedly that the moment in the hallway had been nothing, a fleeting, awkward accident that didn't mean anything. And yet it lingered in the air between Ethan and me, like a shadow neither of us could shake. I avoided him as much as I could, keeping to my room or staying out of the house altogether. When Daniel was home, I clung to him like a lifeline, hoping that the presence of my husband would somehow ground me, remind me of who I was and what I stood for. But even then I could feel Ethan's eyes on me, watching from across the room, quiet and unreadable. It was subtle at first. A glance held a second too long. A quiet good morning that felt heavier than it should. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was projecting my own guilt onto him. But deep down I knew that wasn't true. Something had shifted between us, and no matter how much I tried to ignore it, it was impossible to deny. One evening Daniel was working late, and the house was eerily quiet. I had spent most of the day cleaning, trying to occupy my hands and my mind, but the stillness of the house felt oppressive. I was in the kitchen, wiping down the counters for the third time, when Ethan walked in. "Hey," he said softly, his voice startling me. I looked up, my heart skipping a beat. He was standing in the doorway, his hands shoved into the pockets of his jeans. He looked nervous, like he wasn't sure if he should be there. "Hi," I said, my voice coming out more clipped than I intended. I turned back to the counter, focusing on the task at hand. "Do you need help with anything?" he asked, taking a hesitant step forward. "No. I'm fine," I said quickly. Too quickly. He didn't leave. Instead, he leaned against the doorframe, watching me. I could feel his gaze on me, and it made my skin prickle. I scrubbed at an invisible stain on the counter, hoping he would take the hint and go. But he didn't. "Claire," he said after a long moment, his voice low. I froze, my hand tightening around the sponge. He never called me by my name. It was always "hey" or "excuse me." Hearing him say my name felt strange. Intimate. "What is it?" I asked, not turning around. He trailed off, and I heard him shift uncomfortably. "I feel like things have been weird between us lately." I let out a shaky breath, forcing myself to keep my focus on the counter. "They're not weird," I said, lying through my teeth. "Everything's fine." "Are you sure?" he pressed. "Because it doesn't feel fine." I finally turned to face him, my arms crossed over my chest. "Ethan, there's nothing to talk about. Everything's fine. Let's just move on, okay?" He looked at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded. "Okay," he said quietly. "If that's what you want." "It is," I said firmly, though my voice wavered. He hesitated for a moment longer before turning and walking away. I watched him go, my chest tight with emotions I didn't want to name. Relief, guilt, and something else I couldn't quite put into words. That night I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. Daniel was snoring softly beside me, oblivious to the storm raging inside me. I replayed the conversation with Ethan over and over in my mind, dissecting every word, every glance. I hated the way he made me feel, like I was teetering on the edge of something dangerous, something I couldn't control. I told myself it was just a phase, that he was young and confused, and that I was overthinking everything. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. There was something between us, something unspoken but undeniable, and it terrified me. The next morning, I woke up early, hoping to avoid Ethan altogether. I made myself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, staring out the window as the sun rose. The house was quiet, and for a moment, I allowed myself to breathe, to feel a sense of calm. But then Ethan walked in, and the tension returned like a physical weight. "Morning," he said, his voice soft. "Good morning," I replied, not meeting his eyes. He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down across from me. For a while we sat in silence. The only sound the faint clink of his spoon against his mug as he stirred his coffee. I could feel him watching me, and it made my skin crawl in a way that wasn't entirely unpleasant. "Claire," he said suddenly, breaking the silence. I looked up startled. "What?" I want to make sure we're okay," he said, his eyes searching mine. "I don't want things to be awkward between us." "We're fine," I said quickly. Too quickly. He frowned, clearly not convinced. "Are you sure? Because it doesn't feel like we are." I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. Instead, I just stared at him, my mind racing. He looked so earnest, so vulnerable, and it made my chest ache. I wanted to tell him the truth, to admit that things weren't fine, that I didn't know how to fix this. But I couldn't. "We're fine," I said again, forcing a smile. "Really?" He didn't look convinced, but he nodded anyway. "Okay," he said quietly. As he stood up and walked away, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. But it was short-lived. Because as much as I wanted to believe my own words, I knew they weren't true. Things weren't fine. They were far from it. Over the next few days, the tension between us only grew. It was like a living thing, lurking in the corners of the house, waiting to pounce. Every time I saw Ethan, my heart raced and I hated myself for it. I hated the way my body betrayed me, the way my thoughts spiraled out of control. I started spending more time outside the house, finding excuses to run errands or take long walks. But no matter how far I went, I couldn't escape the thoughts that haunted me. The way Ethan had looked at me in the kitchen, the way his voice softened when he said my name, the way my pulse quickened whenever he was near. I told myself it was just a phase, that it would pass. But deep down I knew the truth. This wasn't just a phase. This was something else entirely. Something dangerous. And I didn't know how to stop it. I looked up startled. He rarely called me by my name. It was always hey or nothing at all. "What is it?" asked, my voice steady despite the nervous flutter in my chest. I wanted to say I'm sorry, he said, his eyes fixed on the floor. "About the other day. I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable." "It's okay," I said quickly too. Quickly. "You don't need to apologize." He nodded, but the tension in his shoulders didn't ease. I don't want things to be weird between us." "They're not weird," I lied. "Everything's fine." He looked at me, then his eyes searching mine, and for a moment, I felt like he could see straight through me. I forced myself to hold his gaze, even as my heart pounded in my chest. "Okay," he said, finally standing. "Good night, Claire." "Good night," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. As he walked away, I let out a shaky breath, my hands trembling in my lap. I told myself it was over, that we had cleared the air and everything would go back to normal. But deep down I knew the truth. Nothing would ever be normal again. I thought the tension would eventually fade, that if I ignored it long enough, it would dissolve into the background, like a bad dream you forget upon waking. But I was wrong. The more I tried to push it away, the more it consumed me. Every glance, every word, every moment I spent near Ethan felt charged with something I didn't want to name. And worse, I could feel it coming from him too. It was subtle at first. A brush of his hand against mine when we passed in the kitchen. A lingering look when he thought I wasn't paying attention. A quiet good night, spoken in a tone that felt far too intimate. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was reading too much into his actions because of my own guilt. But deep down I knew better. He felt it too. One evening, Daniel was working late again, and the house was quiet. Too quiet. I sat on the couch with a book in my lap, though I wasn't reading it. My eyes kept drifting to the clock, counting down the hours until Daniel would come home. I hated being alone with Ethan. Not because I didn't trust him, but because I didn't trust myself. I heard his footsteps before I saw him. He walked into the living room, hesitating in the doorway like he always did. "Hey," he said softly. "Hi," I replied, keeping my eyes on the book. "Can I sit?" he asked. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. He sat down on the opposite end of the couch, leaving a careful distance between us. For a while we sat in silence, the only sound the faint hum of the television in the background. I could feel him watching me, and it made my skin prickle. I tried to focus on the words in front of me, but they blurred together, meaningless. "Claire," he said suddenly, breaking the silence. I looked up, startled. "What?" I feel like we need to talk," he said, his voice hesitant. "There's nothing to talk about," I said quickly, too quickly. "Yes, there is," he insisted, leaning forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "Things have been weird between us, and I don't know how to fix it." "There's nothing to fix," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "Everything's fine." He frowned, clearly not convinced. "You don't believe that." I opened my mouth to argue, but no words came out. Instead, I just stared at him, my heart pounding in my chest. He looked so serious, so earnest, and it made my chest ache. I wanted to tell him the truth, to admit that things weren't fine, that I didn't know how to make them better. But I couldn't, because admitting the truth would mean acknowledging the feelings I had been trying so hard to ignore. "We can't do this," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "Do what?" he asked, his eyes searching mine. "This," I said, gesturing between us. "Whatever this is. It's wrong, Ethan. I'm your stepmother. This can't happen." He flinched at my words, his expression pained. "I know it's wrong," he said softly, "but I can't help how I feel." "Ethan, stop," I said, standing up. "This conversation is over." "Claire, please," he said, standing as well. "Just listen to me." "No," I said firmly, backing away. "This has to stop. Whatever you're feeling, it's not real. It's just confusion. You're young, and I'm here, and you're mistaking that for something else." "It's not confusion," he said, his voice rising. "I know what I feel, Claire. And I know you feel it too." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I stared at him, my chest tight, my mind racing. "You don't know what you're talking about," I said, my voice trembling. "Yes, I do," he said, stepping closer. "I see the way you look at me. I see the way you avoid me. Like you're scared of what might happen if you don't." "Stop," I said, my voice breaking. "Please just stop." He stopped, but he didn't back away. Instead, he looked at me, his eyes filled with something I couldn't name. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "I didn't mean to make you feel like this. I don't know what to do." I wanted to comfort him, to tell him everything would be okay, but I couldn't. Because it wouldn't be. This was a mess, and there was no way to fix it without someone getting hurt. "Go to your room," I said finally, my voice shaking. "Please." He hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Okay," he said quietly. "Good night, Claire." "Good night," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. As he walked away, I sank back onto the couch, my hands trembling in my lap. I told myself it was over, that we had cleared the air, and everything would go back to normal. But deep down I knew the truth. Nothing would ever be normal again. The next morning, I woke up feeling like I hadn't slept at all. My mind was a mess of conflicting emotions. Guilt, shame, and something else I didn't want to name. I avoided Ethan as much as I could, staying in my room or finding excuses to leave the house. But no matter where I went, I couldn't escape the thoughts that haunted me. That evening, Daniel suggested we have a family dinner. "It feels like we've all been so distant lately," he said, smiling as he set the table. "Let's just sit down and have a nice meal together." The irony wasn't lost on me. Distant didn't even begin to cover it. Ethan sat across from me, his eyes flickering to mine every so often. I tried to focus on Daniel, nodding along to his stories about work, but I could feel Ethan watching me. The weight of his gaze was unbearable. I excused myself halfway through the meal, claiming I wasn't feeling well. As I climbed the stairs to my room, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned, my heart sinking when I saw Ethan standing there. "Ethan, you shouldn't." "Please, Claire," he interrupted, his voice urgent. "We need to talk." "There's nothing to talk about," I said, backing away. "This has to stop." "I know," he said, stepping closer. "But I can't stop thinking about you. I know it's wrong, but I can't help it." "Ethan, please don't do this," I whispered, tears welling in my eyes. "This isn't fair, to me, to you, to your father." He hesitated, his expression torn. "I know,"
I'm sorry.
I don't know what to do. I wanted to comfort him, to tell him everything would be okay, but I couldn't. 'Cause it wouldn't be. This was a mess. And there was no way to fix it without someone getting hurt. Go back downstairs, I said, my voice trembling. Please. For a moment I thought he would argue, but then he nodded and turned away. I watched him go, my chest tight with emotions I didn't want to name. That night I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. I knew I had to do something, but I didn't know what. Leaving wasn't an option. I had nowhere to go, no one to turn to, but staying felt impossible. The line between us had blurred, and I didn't know how to draw it back. I didn't know how much longer I could keep everything bottled up. The days passed in a haze, each moment weighed down by guilt and tension that seemed to grow heavier with every passing second. I tried to live as though nothing was wrong, pretending to be the perfect wife, the dutiful stepmother. But deep inside I knew the truth. Everything had spiraled out of control. Daniel, bless him, remained blissfully unaware. He was a good man, devoted and kind, but he didn't notice the subtle shifts in the air around us. Maybe he was too preoccupied with work. Or maybe he trusted me too much to ever suspect anything. Whatever the reason, the guilt I carried felt unbearable every time I looked into his eyes. Ethan, on the other hand, had stopped hiding how he felt. He didn't say it outright, but his actions, his lingering stares, and his very presence spoke volumes. He wasn't trying to make things harder for me on purpose, but his persistence made me feel like I was teetering on the edge of a cliff, waiting for the inevitable fall. One night Daniel was working late again. I sat in the living room, trying to focus on a movie playing on the TV, but my mind was elsewhere. The sound of footsteps pulled me out of my thoughts. And I didn't need to look up to know it was Ethan. It was as though he could sense when I was alone. Hey, he said softly, his voice tentative. Hi, I replied, keeping my eyes glued to the screen. He didn't sit down. Instead he stood there, watching me. We need to talk. No, I said immediately, my tone firm. There's nothing to talk about. There is, he insisted, taking a step closer. We can't keep pretending this isn't happening. I set the remote down and turned to face him. Ethan, I am your father's wife. This cannot happen. Ever. I know, he said, his voice trembling. But I can't stop. I tried, Claire. I really have, but I can't. You have to stop, I said, my voice sharp and unyielding. Where do you think this will lead? Do you think your father won't notice? Do you think he won't be hurt? He lowered his head, but he didn't leave. I don't want to hurt anyone. I can't stop thinking about you. His words hit me like a blow to the chest. I stood up, putting distance between us. Ethan, you're young. You don't understand that these feelings are fleeting. They'll pass. You don't understand, he said, lifting his head to meet my gaze. His eyes were filled with anguish. This isn't fleeting. What I feel is real. You don't know what you're talking about, I said, my voice trembling. You're just confused, and so am I. But this is wrong. Terrible mistake. He didn't move. I'm not confused, he said quietly. I know exactly how I feel. And I know you feel it too. My breath caught in my throat. For a moment, I couldn't find the words to respond. Ethan, stop, I said finally, my voice shaking. You don't know what you're saying. Yes, I do, he said, stepping closer. I see the way you look at me. I see how you avoid me. Like you're afraid of what might happen if you don't. Stop, I said, backing away. Please just stop. He froze, his expression torn between frustration and sorrow. I'm sorry, he said softly. I didn't mean to make you feel like this. I don't know what to do anymore. I wanted to comfort him, to tell him everything would be okay. But it wouldn't be. This situation was a disaster. And there was no way out of it without someone getting hurt. Go to your room, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Please. For a moment he didn't move. Then, with a reluctant nod, he turned and walked away. I stood there, my hands trembling, my heart pounding in my chest. I told myself it was over, that we had finally drawn the line. But deep down I knew the truth. The line had already been crossed. The next morning, I woke up feeling like I hadn't slept at all. My thoughts were a tangled mess of guilt, shame, And something else I couldn't bring myself to name. I avoided Ethan as much as possible, staying in my room or finding excuses to leave the house. But no matter where I went, I couldn't escape the weight of what had happened, or what might still happen. That evening, Daniel suggested we have a family dinner. It feels like we've all been so busy lately, he said with a smile as he set the table. Let's just sit down and enjoy a meal together. The irony wasn't lost on me. Busy wasn't the problem. Distant didn't even begin to cover it. Ethan sat across from me at the table, his eyes flickering to mine every so often. I tried to focus on Daniel, nodding along to his stories about work. But I could feel Ethan's gaze like a physical weight. I excused myself halfway through the meal, claiming I wasn't feeling well. As I climbed the stairs to my room, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned, my heart sinking when I saw Ethan standing there. Ethan, you shouldn't. Please, he interrupted, his voice urgent. We need to talk. There's nothing to talk about, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. This has to stop. I know, he said, stepping closer. But I can't stop thinking about you. I know it's wrong, but I can't help it. Ethan, please don't do this. I whispered, tears welling in my eyes. This isn't fair, to me, to you, to your father. He hesitated, his expression conflicted. I know. I'm sorry. I don't know how to stop. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. You need to figure it out, because this can't happen. It will destroy everything. He nodded slowly, his shoulders slumping in defeat. I'm sorry, he said again, his voice barely audible. Good night, Claire. Good night, I replied, my voice trembling. I watched him walk away, my chest tight with emotions I didn't want to name. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, knowing that something had to change. But I didn't know how. Leaving wasn't an option. I had nowhere to go, no one to turn to. But staying felt impossible. The line between us had blurred, and I didn't know if it could ever be redrawn. The days that followed were suffocating. Every interaction with Ethan felt like walking on a tightrope. The tension between us so palpable it was almost unbearable. Daniel, blissfully unaware, continued to go about his days with his usual warmth and optimism, completely oblivious to the storm brewing beneath the surface of our home. I hated myself for what I had allowed to happen, for the feelings I couldn't control, and for the lies I was now living. But I knew it couldn't go on. Something had to give. And deep down I knew that when it did, there would be no going back. It was a Friday evening when everything finally unraveled. Daniel had planned a special dinner for the three of us, wanting to spend time together before he left for another business trip the following week. He cooked one of his signature meals, the smell of roasted garlic and herbs filling the house, and set the table with the good plates, the ones we only used for holidays or special occasions. I tried to play my part, smiling and laughing at his jokes, but my heart wasn't in it. Across the table, Ethan was quiet, his eyes fixed on his plate. I could feel the weight of his presence, the unspoken words hanging in the air between us like a ticking bomb. Is everything okay? Daniel asked, looking between the two of us. You both seemed distracted. I forced a smile. Just tired, I said quickly. It's been a long week. Ethan didn't say anything, just nodded in agreement. Daniel seemed satisfied with the answer, but I could see the faint crease of concern in his brow. He reached across the table to squeeze my hand, his touch warm and reassuring. It made my stomach churn with guilt. After dinner, Daniel went to his office to finish some work, leaving Ethan and me alone in the kitchen. I busied myself with the dishes, scrubbing the plates harder than necessary, hoping Ethan would just leave. But of course he didn't. Claire, he said softly, his voice breaking the silence. I didn't look at him. Don't, I said, my voice sharp. Not here. Not now. When then? He asked, stepping closer. We can't keep pretending this isn't happening. I turned to face him, my hands still wet from the soapy water. Ethan, please, I whispered, my voice trembling. This has to stop. Whatever this is, it has to end. His jaw tightened, and for a moment he looked like he was about to argue. But then his shoulders slumped and he nodded. You're right, he said quietly. It does. I felt a flicker of relief, but it was short-lived. He stepped closer, his voice barely above a whisper. But before it does, I need to know, was it real? Or was it all in my head? The question hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. Because I didn't know how to answer. I didn't want to lie to him. But the truth felt just as impossible. Before I could say anything, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hall. Ethan stepped back quickly, and I turned to see Daniel standing in the doorway, a puzzled look on his face. "What's going on?" he asked, his eyes flicking between the two of us. "Nothing," I said immediately, too quickly. "We were just cleaning up." Daniel's gaze lingered on me for a moment, and I could see the doubt in his eyes. But he didn't press the issue. "All right," he said finally. "I'm heading to bed. Don't stay up too late. Good night." Ethan and I said in unison, our voices overlapping awkwardly. Daniel gave us one last look before turning and walking away. As soon as he was out of earshot, I turned to Ethan. "This is over," I said firmly. "Do you understand me? It's over." He didn't respond, just nodded and walked out of the kitchen. I stood there for a long time, staring at the soapy water in the sink, feeling like the walls of the house were closing in on me. The next morning, Daniel left early for a meeting, and I decided it was time to take control of the situation. I couldn't keep living like this, couldn't keep lying to my husband, and pretending nothing was wrong. I needed to put distance between myself and Ethan, for both of our sakes. I found Ethan in the backyard, sitting on the edge of the patio with his head in his hands. He looked up when he heard me approach, his expression a mix of sadness and resignation. "I'm leaving," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. His eyes widened. "What?" "I'm going to stay with my sister for a while," I explained. "I need time to think, to figure out what comes next." "Claire, you don't have to do this," he said, standing up. "We can figure this out together." "No, we can't," I said firmly. "This is the only way. I can't stay here. Ethan, not like this." He looked like he wanted to argue, but he didn't. Instead, he nodded, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, "for everything." "So am I," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "But this is the right thing to do." I turned and walked back into the house, my heart heavy but resolute. I packed a bag quickly, not allowing myself time to second-guess my decision. I left a note for Daniel, telling him I needed some time away, but not giving any specific reasons. I couldn't bring myself to tell him the truth, not yet. The drive to my sister's house was long and quiet. The radio played softly in the background, but I barely heard it. My mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions, guilt and regret battling with a strange sense of relief. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. When I arrived, my sister welcomed me with open arms, not asking too many questions. She could tell I was struggling, but she didn't push me to talk. I was grateful for that. I needed time to process everything, to figure out how I had let things get so out of control. Over the next few days, I started to feel like myself again. The distance from Ethan and from the situation gave me clarity. I realized that what had happened wasn't just a mistake, it was a wake-up call. I had been so focused on trying to be the perfect wife and stepmother that I had lost sight of who I was and what I wanted. I knew I needed to have an honest conversation with Daniel. He deserved the truth, even if it meant risking everything. But I also knew that I couldn't go back to the way things were. Something had to change within me, within our relationship, within our family. When I finally called Daniel to tell him I needed to talk, his voice was filled with concern. "Are you okay?" he asked. "I've been worried about you." "I'm okay," I said, though I wasn't sure if that was entirely true. "But we need to talk. About everything." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "All right," he said finally. "Come home, and we'll figure it out together." As I hung up the phone, I felt a strange mix of fear and hope. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for certain. The illusion was over. It was time to face the truth, no matter how painful it might be, because only then could we begin to heal.